It's done. Maybe I was the president of the Roman Empire. Maybe I was Julius Caesar, right? Well, I'm not now. So what do I care, right? And if I was very powerful one day, who cares? I was a little ant, in the kibbutz Tuval. What do I care? I'm not this now. So the point is the future, that what lies ahead. And that's actually really important. That's why we meditate, to prepare for the future, to prepare exactly based on that. And again, very instinctive sense, it continues. We have an instinctive sense, it continues. But at the time of death, somehow it goes out of existence, right? Because we just can't see beyond that, and so therefore we believe in what we can see, and we're very materially oriented. And because we believe less in the mind than in the brain, and because of course the brain doesn't continue, that's why we have such a hard time in past and future lives. And of course our religion, our cultural background also seems to suggest. But honestly, I don't know whether in Judaism really like the possibility of reincarnation is like a no. If you look at some of the, right? Kabbalah, etc. I don't know. As far as I know, there's definitely mentioning of that. Yeah. And in Christianity, there's a lot of research on that. The church, come on, the Catholic Church, I was raised Catholic, so they just wanted that power, and how much more power do you have if there's just one life, right? I mean, you can control people much better, because in the next life you can't control them. So if you tell them there's future lives, etc., you don't have that power on them, versus there's just this one lifetime, you give me money, you do what I tell you, and you'll be safe, right? So there's all this theory on taking it out, because it was more helpful in terms of manipulating people. But if there's future lives, wow, I mean, we can prepare. We can prepare now. And if you want to have a lot of money, robbing a bank may give you only some wealth in this lifetime. But the problem is you can't take that on. So no negative action. This is how bizarre it is in terms of causes and conditions. The only way I can have enough possessions in a future life is if I'm generous. Like your bank robbery thing, you can't take it with you. You can't take that money with you. Okay? So therefore, that aspect is so important. What is it?
What you said that it's no need to know the past because now you're not.
Yes.
There are many psychiatrists that the therapy is reincarnation, and I was in a week like this, and when someone, and like this, in a minute, everybody could see his
yes, you're right.
lifetimes.
Yeah.
And then like a woman who was phobia about water, she saw that she was one drawn in the river.
Okay.
And it's for today, it's very important.
No, I wasn't, when I said the past is not important, I didn't mean that it's not important per se, but it's actually only important because you deal with the future right now, with the present right now, and also for the future. What I meant was people just sometimes want to know just to know, right? Because it's and then there are all these ways of making a lot of money, and then you're told you're this princess, and then that pharaoh, and this, and you're never a frog, and you're never a cow, you're always these great things, and you pay a lot of money for it, so you're happy. But this, I think, is just a rip-off. In the traumatic situations, of course, that it would be important, but in the end, only to be able to deal with the present and to deal with the future. Yeah, so you're right, to learn about this, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about time? We perceive time in a wrong way.
No, we don't perceive time in a wrong way. I don't think we perceive time in a wrong way, but time is relative. But anyway, I'll get more into this, Joy, if we can wait a little bit, because otherwise we'll go off topic too much. But yeah.
The system of Turko is using the past to build a very knowledgeable and talented teacher for the present and future.
That is true, but you're not obsessing about the past.
But you're using it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said early on, I'm not saying we should totally ignore past life. So the system of Turkus, where you install a reincarnated Lama, for instance. So this person is then brought, kind of recognized and provided with a certain situation that allows for that person to continue with their great work. But again, what they've done in the past is past. But recognizing that they have possibly reached a certain mental level, you want to put them in a situation where they can continue to develop their mind or continue to benefit people. And again, it's not important who they were as much, rather as in like giving them the opportunity or giving others the opportunity to benefit from that person again. Yeah. So I'm not saying we should totally ignore the past, of course not. And I agree with also the method of dealing with past trauma, as in like trying to understand it at least. I'm just saying a lot of people are oftentimes more obsessed with past lives than with future lives. And there I think lies the mistake, because we should be more concerned with what lies ahead. All right. Okay, but going back to this here, so you need to have an immediately preceding condition in order to perceive something. Okay, for every mind, there must have been a former moment of perception. And even in the meantime, if you're asleep, for instance, even if you're asleep and there's no eye consciousness while you're asleep, but there's still a mental consciousness. So when you arise from your sleep, there's still an awareness, the eye consciousness can know an object, perceive an object, because you were able to do it a moment earlier, except for the mental consciousness. So the immediately preceding awareness doesn't necessarily need to be of the same continuum, but at least it's either the mental consciousness or any of the other sense consciousnesses. So the mental consciousness definitely needs to have preceded it. Okay? So that is just for an eye consciousness, for instance, that's what you need at the very least. The ability to apprehend this object can only take place or can only be there because a moment earlier it was there. Okay. But you need something more for a sense consciousness. You need for an eye consciousness, for instance, to perceive shape and color. It can perceive shape and color. So for an eye consciousness to perceive shape and color, you must have another cause. So only a moment of perception that preceded that is not sufficient, because that moment of perception only makes it possible for the mind to further perceive. But to perceive shape and color, you need what is called the eye sense power. So what is the eye sense power? Well, the eyes themselves, optical nerve, whatever part of the brain, whatever part of the body that is required to perceive shape and color. All right, so this is what you need for the eye consciousness. For the ear consciousness, there are other parts. For the body consciousness, again. So whatever scientists would accept to be necessary to perceive something, well, for a Buddhist point of view, that's true. All right. And then, if you see, for instance, so for the eye consciousness, let's take the example of an eye consciousness perceiving a table. You'll notice that, as I said yesterday, a mind is dependent on its object, and the object depends on the mind. They're mutually dependent. You can't have one without the other. So, when I say table, right, so we may think, oh, there must be some objective table over there, otherwise we couldn't perceive it. But that's very difficult to establish. So basically there's the table you perceive, there's the table I perceive, and whether there's something else, well, that's the big question. What would that be? But just leaving that aside, so when I say table, eye consciousness perceives table, so therefore the table depends on the eye consciousness, and the eye consciousness depends on the table, in the case of this particular eye consciousness. Alright, so this is how we usually refer to a consciousness. Usually we don't just say eye consciousness, but we specify an eye consciousness perceiving a certain object. Alright, so taking the eye consciousness perceiving a table, the fact that it can perceive its object is because of the immediately preceding condition. The fact it can perceive shape and color is because of the eye sense power. And the fact it perceives a table is because there is an object called table. Right? So that is the observed object condition. The object that is observed. Subjectively existent, but nonetheless it's still a table. A table exists. So these are the three conditions. In order for an eye consciousness or a sense consciousness to arise, you must have those three. An immediately preceding condition, something as part of the body, like a sense power that enables you to perceive a specific type of object, shape, color, sound, etc., and an object itself, the observed object condition. Now this is true for the eye consciousness. For the the mental consciousness, you don't need all three. You don't need all three. For the mental consciousness, which one do you not need? The object you don't need, and sense power. Sense power you don't need. The mental consciousness, of course, in order to perceive shape and color, you must have a sense consciousness that gives rise. A blind person who's been blind since birth, I don't think they have a perception of blue. Unless I remember from a previous life. But leaving aside that, in general, I don't think that most people don't have memory of past life. So therefore, I don't think they know what blue is. The mental consciousness cannot have a perception of blue the way we do. But nonetheless, this perception of the mental consciousness, it can perceive things that don't depend on the senses. Right? We can think of things, of course there's a great influence of the senses, but we can also take to mind objects that don't have a correlation to the sense objects. So therefore, the mental consciousness is much more independent. As in, like, it can think of past objects, future objects, they don't have to be here right now, and you don't need a sense power. Without sense power, you can still think about objects. So without a physical body, the mental consciousness can still exist. Okay, so this is also, no, never mind, it's too much. But, okay, so going back to the causes, therefore, we say that for sense consciousness, you always need three causes. For a mental consciousness, you only need the immediately preceding condition. Okay? But other conditions can, of course, be helpful. All right, so that is what it says on page 12, and then it goes on. So those are the three conditions. You can read through them. I basically said the same thing, and maybe some more explanation in the text that I just don't remember right now. And so then what follows is explaining that those sense consciousnesses, well, they're very helpful, of course. They allow us to communicate, they allow us to learn, they allow us... But it's, of course, the mental consciousness that digests everything, it interprets things, it labels things, etc. So the mental consciousness is most important, and the five sense consciousnesses are just the tools. Right? So from a positive point of view, they can be very helpful. From a negative point of view, they can also be responsible for our attachment. Of course, we can't blame the sense consciousnesses, really. It's our mental consciousness that grows attached to good smells or beautiful sights and so forth. But they all play part in that process of growing attached to sights, sounds, etc. All right. And so sense consciousnesses, they have this special quality that they perceive their objects nakedly, directly, right there. But they're also limited in time. You can only perceive something that existed a split second before. You can't perceive something with your eye consciousness that happened yesterday or will happen tomorrow. So therefore it's limited in terms of time. You can only perceive things that have just happened, basically. Plus, you're limited in terms of sense objects. You can only perceive sense objects. But it's a very vivid experience, very clear, very vivid. Your mental consciousness, our mental consciousness, can think of the past, present, and future. It can think of things that are far away, but it doesn't have that vividness. Okay, we get to that. It doesn't have that vivid kind of perception. All right. Okay, so this is what it says here. That the sense consciousnesses have their advantage and their disadvantage, and so does the mental consciousness. All right. And most importantly, well, the mental consciousness is always present, even when we die. And this is where, again, modern science helps us. Cases of near-death experience which have been investigated, which have been examined. And it's very interesting that even at the time of near-death experience, people have very vivid experiences. Like they come back from this experience, they were brain dead, and still when they are revived, so there was no brain activity, and still they had these very vivid experiences without any brain activity. So they talk about seeing this and perceiving that, and I don't know, being fearful, being joyful, etc. So that supports the Buddhist idea that a sattva, and it's a sattva type of mind, that can actually exist without the mental consciousness, right? So even though there's no brain activity or very vivid experiences, and again, if you go online, there are many case studies of people like talking about this. Of course, they could all be lying, but why would they lie? I mean, the way they describe it, one of my favorite ones is for a neuroscientist. He happened to be a neuroscientist, and he contracted meningitis. He became sick with meningitis and fell into a coma. And during the coma, there was a moment he was brain dead. I don't know whether they would call it a near-death experience, but he had this very vivid experience. He says, like, he was in this different place, and he had no language. He had lost his ability to think, because that's to use words when you're thinking, because that's a Kosa type of mind. So he has a memory of perceiving things and reflecting upon things, but he had no language to do so. And he himself, there's this one comment as like a conclusion of the experience he had. He said, previously I thought the mind was the brain, but I know from my own experience that the mind exists separate from the brain. So that's from my own experience. And he was told he was brain dead, etc., and his mind was still very active. So this is again another point. The mind is right now very dependent on the brain. In fact, to have a human mind right now is because we have a human brain. And we're limited in one way. On the other hand, we have a lot of great abilities that animals don't have because they have a different brain. For now, as long as they're with this brain or with this body. But still, our mind can exist separately from this brain. Mm-hmm. And our limitations, we can actually overcome them once we leave this body and develop our mind in a way through meditation, for instance.
Can I ask? There are cases of people who lose the brain activity for a while, and then they describe that they could see out of the room and hear the people talking. So how they hear the people talking, according to Buddhism?
Yeah. I was kind of concerned this question would come up. All right, so what Chaya is talking about is, I give you another example I've heard about on the BBC. There was a lady who was involved in an accident, and she died during that time. She actually died. She was brain dead, and they revived her, and she was stabilized and brought to hospital. And later on, when she recovered, she asked to thank the ambulance for her help. And so she was taken to this room where a lot of members of the ambulance were, and she walked up right to the people who were there in the accident, and she said, "You were there, thank you very much. You were there, thank you very much." And they were like, "How do you know?" And she said, "Well, I saw you guys, It was kind of like looking at it from above, and I could see all of you." So she was there, she was right there, and she saw the whole thing happen, and she was very grateful to the people who helped her and wanted to thank them. So the point is here, how could she see? She could hear what they were saying. She could hear, I think the story goes on, like she could actually recount some of the things they were saying, etc. And they were like, yeah, that's really what happened. So how can you have a sense consciousness even though in that moment you are dying or whatever you are? Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, this goes into more detail, but it's incomplete without it. It's not the question that he had about being poked by a needle, for instance. That is different. But actually, we talk about subtler bodies. We don't just talk about a subtler mind, we also talk about subtler bodies. So it's actually theoretically possible that you can leave your body, but if you leave your body, you take on a subtler, if you leave your physical body, your mind can leave it, but it can only do so through a subtler body. So you always have some type of body, which is subtler. So like they talk about dream bodies or whatever. So it's an energy actually that goes along with your mind at all times, and then that energy can just manifest in a subtler type of body, where you have sense awareness. So you have sense awareness, but it's not as limited as our sense awareness is right now. So you still have a sense consciousness, okay? But his question was, how about when you awake because of a sense object? The sun very powerful sun that shines into your face, or a strong smell. My neighbor, they have this habit of frying chili early in the morning, or making these greasy pancakes. And they start doing it like sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning when his home is teaching, so I can't help it, I wake up. Oh, this overwhelming smell of pancakes, and then it goes away and it's fine. But I do wake up, or the alarm clock, of course. Now, this accounts, the way that is explained is that there's still the sense perception, right? The sense powers are still activated, and because of that strong sense perception and their correlation to the body, they bring out the mind from that deep state. So they can still awaken. You can still awaken because they're connected. Body and mind are connected. So even though the sense consciousness lies dormant in that moment, but because of the strong input, and it has to be relatively strong. If you just whisper into someone's ear, ordinarily when they're awake, they would hear that. But if they're asleep, that's not enough for them to wake up, unless they wake up naturally. So there are these stimulants. If they're strong enough, they affect the body in such a way that it connects to the sense consciousness and it wakes it up. Okay, so that otherwise, how could you ever wake up? I mean, like, we still have that strong relation between mind and body. But then, how come you can perceive a dream? For instance, in your dream, you perceive the alarm clock as. So, didn't you perceive, like in your dream, you perceive it? No. So here the theory is, and one of my teachers once explained that, Geshe Kelsang, his theory was like, we wake up briefly when the alarm clock goes off. Just a moment of being awake, and right away we fall asleep again. It's like being awake, and we're not long enough awake to be aware we're awake, so we hear the alarm clock, and right away we fall asleep again, and that becomes part of our dream. And we wake up again. It goes up and down, which is why usually this only happens when we're about to wake up, when our sleep is much lighter. So you may notice early in the morning, you wake up, you fall asleep, wake up, fall asleep, wake up, fall asleep. It happens all the time, which is why at that time external sense objects can become part of your dream. But when you're in deep sleep at night, I don't think it really happens, right? It's quite rare. You may totally miss that thunderstorm because you're so deep asleep and you just don't wake up. All right. So, anyway, so this is the explanation here of sense objects, sense minds, sense awarenesses or sense consciousness versus mental consciousnesses. All right. And then, of course, you can now integrate what we've learned before. So sense consciousnesses, correct sense consciousnesses and wrong sense consciousnesses. So it's pretty easy. It's not that difficult to understand. But here, we'll move away a little bit. Well, we do talk about their objects existing or not existing, but we also move towards what does a mind do or not do. Okay? All right. So first of all, you have a sense consciousness that is a correct consciousness, and you have a sense consciousness that is a wrong consciousness. Does that make sense? All right. Well, we already went through it. Its main object doesn't exist. All right. So perceive the stick to be a snake with your eye consciousness. There you have a wrong consciousness. And you can mentally go, oh yeah, it's like that, and you actually believe it, and you have a mental wrong consciousness too. But basically, we can be mistaken. I mean, we are mistaken all the time. You sit in a train, and there's a train on the next platform, and the other train is moving, and you think you're moving, right? Classic wrong consciousness. The one with the mirror, like when I walk towards the mirror, okay? Sound, perceiving an echo, or to be perceived the voice that comes from an MP3 player or a tape recorder, perceiving that to be the voice of a person, okay? Perceiving, like for instance, in the case of like amputees, right? When they have like phantom pain, they have pain in their hands, but actually there's no hand, wrong consciousness. So lots of wrong consciousnesses and lots of right consciousnesses too. All right, so that's easy. But then to take it further, so this is what it explains on page 14, it kind of mentions it. So this is described as sense consciousnesses. All right, let me just see what was there before. Sorry, just before that. Okay, so the part before that I think is pretty easy about how the sense consciousnesses are affected by the mental consciousness labeling something. So there's this, first of all, we perceive something with our sense consciousnesses, and then on the basis of that we label vase, for instance. We then call something a table or a vase, but it can also go the other way around. Once we've labeled something, then our sense consciousnesses are more likely to perceive it. So as children, we learned to understand the distance between this object and that object. We now perceive it with our eye consciousness, but initially we were not able to interpret the shadows and certain other hints that allow us to perceive the distance between two objects. So now we know our sense consciousnesses perceive objects in a certain way, and I would not be surprised that, and this is not what it says in the scriptures, but it would make sense that when you're born you just perceive this blur of shapes and colors, and your sense consciousnesses can't make sense of it. But then you learn through labeling, you make sense of the things around you. So for instance, when you throw a ball at a child, have you ever done that? Like a toddler, right? They're like, hey, right? And like they close their hands in the wrong moment, right? The ball is already gone again. Because you haven't learned yet through labeling, etc., to estimate the distance and when to move, you know, like all this with the sense consciousnesses, etc., until eventually you've been able to learn it, and it comes towards you, and you know exactly when it's going to be here, and so therefore you're able to hold on to it and catch it in the right moment. It's all part of the labeling. It's all part of what our senses now perceive versus, or sense consciousnesses now perceive versus before we labeled. Okay? Anyway, can't go into all this in detail, but basically our sense perception is influenced by our mental consciousness, and our mental consciousness our mental consciousness is influenced by our sense perception. All right. Anyway, so then going back to the two types of sense consciousness. So a sense consciousness that is a direct perceiver, and a sense consciousness that is a wrong consciousness. So far I've not used the word direct perceiver. That's a technical term, a direct perceiver. But it's just another way of saying a sense consciousness that is a correct sense consciousness, that becomes a direct perceiver. So don't get caught up in the words. Every sense consciousness is a direct mind. Direct as in like it directly perceives its object. And direct and indirect will be explained further when we continue with the study here. But a direct perceiver, of course, every mind perceives something. But direct perceiver means a mind that, well, it's not conceptual, but it's non-conceptual. We talk about conceptual. But a mind, like a sense consciousness that directly perceives its object, that is not conceptual, and it's correct. That's another word for direct perceiver. Okay, it's a correct mind. It's not wrong, and it's also not conceptual. For right now, it's a little difficult. So I've used this word already here, but it'll be all explained to you as we go along. So sense consciousnesses that are right consciousnesses or correct consciousnesses, and sense consciousnesses that are wrong consciousnesses. I could explain it that way, or I can use the word sense consciousness that are direct perceivers, and those that are wrong consciousness. Okay. But then it goes on to say, a correct consciousness, a direct perceiver, a sense consciousness that is a correct mind or a direct perceiver, well, now there's another further difference that has nothing to do with the object, or less to do with the object, more with what the mind can do. Because you can perceive something and know it, and not know it. Okay? Now that's a weird distinction. You know it, or you don't know the object. Okay. Now, to give you an example, right now, your 5 consciousnesses are all there. 5 sense consciousnesses are all there. So let's take the scenario. Now you're all hungry, so this goes well to visualize. You're sitting in front of a TV, and you're watching a movie, and you're listening to the dialogue that is part of the movie. You're eating a sandwich. You have some incense burning, and someone gives you a massage. Oh. Perfect, right? For right now, I can tell you're all a little bit tired. So this is, wow, imagine, right? Okay, how many sense consciousnesses are active? 1 by 1. Ah, so okay. Now, mental consciousness is there all the time. You need to think about the movie, you reflect upon it, you try to understand it. All right. So it seems that